Recording started. Welcome everyone to yet another installation of the Learning Experience Design webinar series presented by the AECT Design and Development Division. I'm Matthew Schmidt, President of the Design and Development Division, and today I am pleased to introduce Niels Floor. I have a bio that I'm going to read to you for Niels, and then I'm going to pass the microphone to him. Niels Floor is a pioneer in the field of learning experience design. He's dedicated his professional life to the application, development, and promotion of LXD since 2007. As the creator of the Learning Experience Canvas, initiator of the Lxd Conference, Lxd Con, and founder of Lxd.org, Niels is absolutely a driving force in the global LXD community. He's also the owner of Shapers, an international LX design and training agency located in Utrecht in the Netherlands. He co-founded the company in 2001 after studying graphic design and obtaining a master's degree in interaction design from the University of Portsmouth. After a couple of years of working as a designer, Niels started to teach interaction design, user experience design, media theory, and learning experience design at several Dutch universities. He also ran a 6-month LXD program from 2009 to 2015 at Avans University of Applied Sciences in Breda in the Netherlands. Today, Niels and his team work for a wide variety of clients, and I won't go into all of those clients now, but he also collaborates with several educational institutions like the Utrecht School of the Arts, Leiden University, Delft University, and so on. As a trainer, he's provided both face-to-face training across Europe and also in other areas and online training as well. So with that introduction, I'm going to pass the mic to Niels. Niels, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Not much to add there. I have my first slide is dedicated to kind of introducing myself. So as you said, Shapers, my company. Creating the learning experience canvas, I did that in 2013, and I kind of did that for myself, for me and my company to design better learning experience, but it took on a life of its own, basically. And I made it available for free because people asked for it. And since then, it's been downloaded by thousands of people, and it kind of spun off into a LXD community around the world. And me and my team wanted to support that community a bit better. So we created Lxd.org, which is a platform for anything learning experience design. So feel free to look it up and check it out. And as Matthew said, my background is in design and in education. I'm primarily a designer coming into the field of education. And when I was kind of combining those two worlds as a designer in the field of learning, I thought, well, there's something there that can really be beneficial to the learner when you think about that we learn from what we experience. I was already designing experiences, so why not design experiences people learn from? Now, that was back in 2007, as Matthew said. And back then, people didn't know, and most people didn't really care about this. So it was a long, long journey up until now, where I've been applying and developing and promoting learning experience design globally. And that journey has brought me to a lot of interesting places and countries, met a lot of interesting people. And it's also going to bring me to Philadelphia in August 4th. I'll be hosting a masterclass, a one-day masterclass, and you can look at Lxd.org. And I believe there's also Matthew has a flyer he's going to share as well. So if you're interested, or you know people who are interested, feel free to look it up, and maybe I'll see you in Philadelphia. All right, but before we go to Philadelphia, we're going to look at some European perspectives. And it's quite funny that I never really thought of it that way, but when I talked to Matthew about the kind of work that I do and the overlap between Matthew's and my ideas and mine, we came to the conclusion that there is an element to my work that is quite European as opposed to maybe American or Asian. Or so we're going to look at that today. And so we're going to start this journey in Europe and specifically in Italy. So I traveled to Italy 2 times, and I visited the incredible city of Florence. And I love arts, and that's the perfect place to go to if you're into arts, especially if you're into painting as I am. So I went to the renowned Galleria Uffizi, the Uffizi Museum, and there's all this incredible Renaissance art there to be seen. I was looking forward to it a lot, but there was one painting that I wasn't really interested in that's really, really famous. And the reason I wasn't interested in it because I had seen it so many times in my art history books. It's on posters, it's on lunch boxes, it's on everywhere. And that's this painting, The Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli. So I walked into the room where this painting is on the display, and I was simply blown away. I was expecting very little of it, and I was totally impressed by it. And it was a big shock to me because it was the total opposite of what I was expecting. And it made me think about, so I knew this painting, I disliked it, and now I love it straight away. How is that possible? Now, what Sandro Botticelli already understood is that when you create a painting, you want to offer people an experience. You want to show them something that's going to really, inspire them or make them feel something, make them see something. And when you look at this close-up, there is a certain graphic quality to this painting that feels very modern and fresh still today, which was one of the things that really impressed me. A fun fact about this painting is that Botticelli was the first painter in Florence to paint on canvas. Before that, everyone was painting on wood, and canvas was seen as a cheap material, but that allowed him to create a bigger painting. And the size of this painting is one of the reasons that's so incredible. Now, the experience of being there in the city of Florence and seeing this painting for real made such a big difference as opposed to seeing this in my art history books. And even though I knew the painting and I knew the facts about the painting, I had to study them, it felt like I hadn't known anything about it up until that moment. So that made me think about how important it is to have a great experience and an authentic experience. Now, in learning, often of course, we can't always go to Italy to see this painting if we need to learn about it. But in learning, we tend to kind of stray from reality and to turn things into something maybe a bit superficial, like watching an image of a painting instead of watching the actual painting. I think there's a lot, for me, there was a lot I learned from just seeing this in real life and understanding the power of a great experience. So that's why today I wanted to start with art, European art in this respect, to look at the word experience first, because experience is at the core of what I do as a learning experience designer. What I create is not a teaching aid necessarily, or I don't design a curriculum, or I don't design a course specifically. I design the whole experience, and all those elements, the teaching aids or other materials or an app or a platform, those are elements of that experience, but it's not the complete experience. And designing an experience versus designing a course is a big difference. Now, when I talk about experience, it's important to look at it from a very broad perspective, and I'll explain why that's important in just a moment. So the way I define experience is any situation that you encounter that takes a certain amount of time and leaves some kind of impression. And when you think about it, that's basically anything we go through. Now, why is it so important? Well, if you create experiences, and as a designer, you know, your driving force is creativity. So you need creative freedom in order to get the most out of your design, in this case, out of this experience. So by defining experience really broadly, you can let go of some of the assumptions we have about what an experience should be like, what a learning experience should be like. For instance, when I say learning experience, maybe you think about a classroom, or maybe you think about online education, or maybe you think about teaching, or maybe you think about books or any, and those are all preconceived notions and assumptions about what a learning experience looks like. And I want to be totally free to create whatever works best for the learner. And going back to art, that's comparable to an empty canvas where anything is still possible, instead of already having a canvas that's kind of sketched out. You kind of only have to maybe paint by numbers. So you want to be free to create whatever you want. So this experience is what you design. And once again, going back to art, I see design as an applied form of art. There are different types of design, of course, but being a creative professional, for instance, the way that graphic design is an applied form of visual arts. And for me, art is a huge source of inspiration as a designer. There are many lessons to be learned there. So using your creativity, your design skills to design experiences. And those experiences have a clear goal, which is learning. So it's not educational experience design or teaching experience design. The focus is always on the learner, the process of learning, the experience they have and what they get out of this experience. So in a way, learning experience design explains itself. And it's an experience you design intended for learning. But there's more to it, because this experience has specific qualities. First of all, it's a human experience, and that implies a lot. Traditionally, learning can be seen as a student being an empty vessel, and you pour knowledge into this empty vessel or other expertise. I try to have a more holistic approach, because you're designing for real people, and real people are not just a set of brains. People also have emotions, and they are social, and they interact with each other. So when you design a learning experience and you focus on people, you think about not just what they're going to learn from this experience, but also how this experience is going to make them feel, and how these feelings are going to influence what they learn and what they can and can't achieve. And also you think about how are people going to interact with each other. Learning is often and most preferably a social process, something where people interact with each other. So if you want to achieve that, you need to apply human-centered design. And human-centered design is really about putting people at the heart of your design process and at the heart of your design. I always say you want to make the people the star of your experience. So human-centered design is an important part of designing learning experiences. But these experiences, they also are goal-oriented. And goal-oriented design is a term that comes from interaction design, where you think about what kind of goals do I want to achieve, or does a user traditionally want to achieve, and what can I do to enable this person to achieve that goal? What kind of choices is he or she going to make? What kind of support do you get? And so using those principles of goal-oriented design and human-centered design, you're able to design experiences people learn from in a human-centered and goal-oriented way. And that's where my definition of learning experience design comes in. This is what I kind of came up with a couple of years ago, that learning experience design is the process of creating learning experiences that enable the learner to achieve the desired learning outcome in a human-centered and goal-oriented way. And this is the only slide I'm going to read out loud, because almost all my slides are just illustrations. But when people see this definition, there's still a lot of room for interpretation. And it's interesting that, you know, learning experience design is appealing to many people from different kinds of backgrounds. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment, but that's why I want to add another layer to this and highlight a couple of words. So creating is highlighted because it's a creative process. And I'm going to look at that process in a moment, but a creative process is different, for instance, than a scientific process. It doesn't mean that learning experience design doesn't have any element of science in it, and I'll get back to that later as well. But as I said, as an applied form of art, creative professionals have a creative process to create things. There's a lot of creation there. So that's the first one. The second one, enable. So it's not about teaching someone, it's about enabling someone to achieve a certain outcome. And I see, for me, design has always been something, a discipline that serves other people. It's not about you as a designer, it's about who these people are and how you can best support them. Whether it's when you create a graphic design, that's something that is appealing to them and that's clear, that communicates a clear message. Or when it's a learning experience, that you create something that is enabling and empowering to the learner. And then I talked about human-centered and goal-oriented. Those are both design principles. And applying those really makes a big difference in how you create a learning experience. And by the way, if people have questions, I see Jamie says something. I like that this definition lends itself towards compatibility with a range of learning theories, such as self-determined. That's a great point, Jamie. So learning experience design in itself is not a learning theory. In fact, the only learning theory that's really kind of standard linked to this is experiential learning, but then not determined, not defined as learning by doing, but really as the science of how we learn from what we experience. So that's linked to learning experience design. But I want designers or any learning experience designer or instructional designers or any educational expert or learning and development professionals to be able to pick the best learning theory or strategy within their design that's going to work. So it's not going to determine the learning theory you need to apply as a learning experience designer. So I love the fact that you point that out, Jamie. Thanks for that. Now, to make it a bit clearer, we have these four quadrants: the design side, the learning side, and there are a lot of fields that have kind of been intertwined into what learning experience design is and has become, and the way it's also still developing. So on the design side, we have goal-oriented design and we have human-oriented design. And for instance, games are very goal-oriented, where interaction design is very human-oriented. You think about the psychology of the user, what kind of choices they make, how to support them, as I just talked about in goal-oriented design. So there's a lot of design disciplines, and there's elements of all of this that's linked to learning experience design. Now, about the European perspective, it's the field experience design is quite common here, especially in Scandinavia. And I'm not in Scandinavia, but it's nearby. And that's an interesting field that's quite linked quite strongly to learning experience design. You know, people who use their creativity to come up with these incredible experiences that are often highly enjoyable and can be very transformational. So there's a lot of, originally when I was getting into learning experience design, I was mostly linked to other European experience designers. On the other hand, on the other side, there's the learning side. So you have the human side of learning, the scientifics, the sciences, neuroscience, psychology, experiential learning, as I just pointed out. And then there's the application of learning, goal-oriented training, teaching, and instructional design, which is, of course, it can also be more scientific, but it's where you take those scientific insights and you apply them to situations where people learn. Now, as learning experience design got more attention and started to spread across the US as well, instructional design became more part of the whole debate. So what is LXD? What is instructional design? How do they compare? In my opinion, it's part of the mix, but it's not the origin, the sole origin of learning experience design. I have no background in instructional design, but I've worked with many instructional designers and I've trained many of them. And there are quite some differences in the approach and in the methodologies. But of course, the goals are more or less identical. It's just a different approach to get there. I love to learn from instructional designers to improve my learning experiences, and I think the other way around is also very well possible. Okay, so when you design this experience, a learning experience, very quickly, this is how I work in essence, and this is the way basically any creative professional works. You have a question: what do I want to achieve? What do I want to solve? That's when you need to do research. You do user research or learner research. You research the outcome that you are trying to achieve, the objectives you are setting. And once you know what you want to achieve and who is the learner, you design, you ideate, you conceptualize, you visualize. And then it's time to build a prototype. You test your prototype, you learn from it, and this iterative cycle, happens a couple of times until your design is ready to launch. Now, this is the way I work, and I think it's a very fun way to work, but it's also not the most predictable way to work. So design can be a bit unpredictable and sometimes messy. So for the clients that I work with, this is sometimes a challenge where they would prefer to have everything clear from the beginning. But as I said, I start with an empty canvas. Anything is possible. So any kind of design is possible, but that's something to keep in mind. All right, so what do I design then? I want to take, I still got 15 minutes. So I want to take a moment to talk about a project I did a number of years ago, where there's a bit of history in this as well for you, a small history lesson, which is about when the Dutch went from Amsterdam and they set foot in Manhattan, and they founded New Amsterdam, which later became New York. And that was 400 years ago. And a few years ago, that was 400 years ago, and it was celebrated. And I was asked to, as a learning experience designer, to create with a multidisciplinary team, a learning experience for students in Amsterdam and New York, learning simultaneously about their shared history. And I've referred to arts a couple of times already for inspiration, and we used literature as the inspiration for this project. The author Russell Shortall wrote a book, The Island at the Center of the World, about about life of Dutch people, the life of Dutch people, also some Germans and Italians and Spanish, but founding New Amsterdam, living there together with the Native Americans, and that part of history. And we wanted to make that come alive. So one of the things that was really important in why New Amsterdam was founded was for trade. So we decided to develop a trading game as the let's say the main part of this experience. So we took actual physical places in Amsterdam and in, well, New Amsterdam or New York, where students would have to go and play this training game and kind of experience for themselves how things worked back then. And as they played this game, they would get all these messages and you know, about fictional but realistic news at the time about how beaver fur was out of fashion in Paris, so stock was down. And actually, the stock market was an important part of this experience. And the stock market was actually a, I'll get to that question in a moment. Stock market was a Dutch invention, actually. I learned that then. I didn't know that. But so we wanted to make this period come alive in a fun way and in a realistic way. So that's what we did. And they had some in the classroom, they had some activities to prepare them for this, to have some history lessons, for the Dutch students, some English lessons, because they communicate with the students in New York as well. But they would have to physically get out to different places, trade, bargain. And the fun thing was that this was designed for different levels of secondary education, from relatively, well, I would say low level, but towards more practical and the higher theoretical level. And you could use different strategies. So maybe you would run faster, you would be a better negotiator, you would have a better timing. So anyone could win this game. So it was a lot of fun to work with. Now you can imagine, looking at this cycle that I just showed, that we had to go through several iterations to finally come up with this kind of design, because it had never been done and you don't know exactly how it's going to work. So we did a lot of designing, testing, prototyping, getting back to drawing board, and that was really great fun. Now, Samet said, do you include learners in early stages of the design as well? As much as I can. And what I mean by that is, ideally, you will have learners in every step of the process, have them involved in every step of the process. There are great ways for your research, of course, to determine what kind of question you're trying to answer, to really know what you're aiming for, to have them co-create designs, to have them test your designs, all sorts of possibilities. Often reality is that you don't always have learners available to you at every step of the process. I've talked to an instructional designer who said, well, my company doesn't allow me to speak with learners because they are clients. So sometimes people aren't even allowed to interact with learners. I want to try and interact with them as much as possible. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Yeah. So I'm talking really fast. So as a learning experience designer, what are the kind of things that you have to deal with, the things you have to be good at, in my opinion? So I made this illustration to kind of illustrate that, no pun intended. So I'm going to start with aligning perspectives. This project, for the island project, thanks, Matthew. We had like IT people, we had producers, we had the writer of the book, who's also a historian. We had another historian. We had who was also partly a game designer, I think. Then we had different visual designers, all sorts of people, and all those different stakeholders have different perspectives and different needs and wants and desires. And we have the students, of course. We have the teachers. And one of the trickiest things was to get all those perspectives aligned and make sure that the end result, the actual experience, was something that they all were excited about, that works, that they felt like it was the right design. That was a great challenge. And let's see, Pauline says, since you sometimes don't have access to interact with learners, can you share how you do your research in order to analyze the learners, what they need? That's a great question. Yeah. So you want to get as close to learners as possible. So sometimes if you can find people from a similar audience or target group, you can already learn from them. Then there's just the desktop research. If you know the age group, the kind of demographics about the learner, then you can, there are a lot of resources out there that can help you to get a better picture. If you really don't have any access to learners, you really need to trust sources who talk about or who explain things about that group of people. Or you can talk to, often our clients have know a lot about their learners. Maybe I want to work for a company and its employees, and I can't get to these employees. I can still talk to the client who knows his or her employees. So if it's not directly, find an indirect way to talk to them. And if there's really no, if you just have to go on anything you can find outside of direct interaction with the learner, then that's just reality. And that's when a good design process really helps to try and make it as suitable as possible. But it's hard. You do need that interaction with the learner, possibly. So that's a good question. But yeah. Yeah, I have used social media. So online ethnography, sorry, difficult word, is an interesting design research method, where you go into for instance, into a LinkedIn group or a Facebook group, and you interact with the learners. And I've done that from time to time. I don't use social media a lot myself, but for those reasons I will. Reddit, I know about Reddit, but I've never used it. So that's a good tip. Like I said, I'm not very. I don't know that much about social media, but if that's a way to get closer to people, and sometimes I just ask my network, does anyone knows someone in this age group, or and I try to reach people who are going to fit that description as well. So yeah, but I'm not a Reddit user yet, but I will check it out. Okay, so in aligning perspectives, then you need to be original. We talked about art a lot already, or I talked about art a lot, and one of the strengths of an artist is that you have an original artwork. And I want to create original designs, things that haven't been done before, because what are the chances that the best possible solution for a specific situation, a certain learner with certain goals, already exists? You always need to make it as original as possible. And you need great ideas for that, and that's where originality comes in. You also need to be able to both analyze and create, and and alternate between those. So it is a creative discipline, but you also need to be analytical, of course. If you don't, if you're not being analytical, you will miss out on your research. So then I talk about creative freedom that gives me, and should any designer give them wings. And so if you can imagine it, you're going to try to make it work. You care for the learner, you empathize with the learner. It's always a combination of kind of hard facts about the learner and getting to know them, and kind of being able to walk in their shoes and understand a little bit about how they feel about things. And what I've learned from many designs that I've created is that if you care for the learner and you design with care, they will feel cared for. So they feel your intention in the design that you create. That's what I've experienced. And finally, I included use science. I am not a scientist, and I'm sure there are scientists who are super creative as well, but I often work with scientists to make sure that what I create is based on a strong foundation, not just on design research, but also on scientific research. I have a very short example that I'm going to share. And then we're going to go into some more discussion. And that's about how our memory works on a very basic level. We all know about how we have a sensory memory, our senses that sends information to our working memory, but that's already something where it's not just a cognitive process, it's also an emotional process. And of course, you can discuss that emotion is part of the cognitive process, but I separated them because I want to make the point that, you know, emotion influences how we learn, how we feel, how we experience. So our senses send a signal to our working memory, for instance, about an apple. Now, if you want to learn the word apple in a different language, you can show a picture of an apple and say, this is an apple. But that would only use the ears and the eyes. If you would give someone an apple and say, this is an apple, and they would taste it, they would use all their senses. And I always like to say that more senses makes more sense when you provide someone with an experience. So because these are separate signals in our sensory memory, they need to be combined, and the best way to combine them to make a strong memory is by activating all senses. So maybe in your long-term memory, as you learn this word, you think about the first time you saw an apple on an apple tree, and that memory may be very fond about a wonderful day, maybe you're out with your grandparents, whatever. But that's how you make a memory stick. More senses makes more sense. You have these emotional connections, you have these physical connections, those cognitive connections to make great memories. Right, so I'm going to treat myself to a sip of water in just a moment. If you want to, thank you all, and if you want to look up some of the stuff that I'm doing, shapers.nl, we're Dutch, lxdcanvas.com, and lxd.org for all your learning experience needs. So thank you all so much. I would love to see your faces and to have a chat with you, because there have been some great questions already. Thank you. I appreciate that. So if you like to turn on your camera and your microphone, I'd be happy to hear your voices and any questions you have, or maybe tips. We're here to learn from each other. It's a bit quiet. Well, I have a question for you, and you can react to that maybe. I'm just curious if this felt like, in any way, like a different / European perspective to what you might have expected, or maybe what your concept, how you would conceive learning experience design. How European am I? I like to think that I'm like a global citizen. But it turns out I'm quite European after all.
I'll jump in, Niels. From my perspective, what you presented today is much different than some of the perspectives that we have in the States on traditional instructional design. Now, I know we're talking about learning experience design, but the AECT membership is largely drawn from instructional design circles and traditional learning design circles. That you started from art and aesthetics, that is not typically the perspective that leads into conversations about instructional design. So that's one of the first things that struck me, was that you're thinking about aesthetics. This is beginning to get some prominence in the States, and There are some people who are thinking more about beauty in learning design and the importance of beauty and aesthetics. But if you want to know how much literature is written about it, it's really just kind of a handful of studies or thought pieces, if you will. That was a piece that was resonant with me. And the other piece is really kind of centered around the centrality of the learner in your process. And it's not just designing for the learner, but designing with the learner. And again, those are things that are beginning to kind of emerge in the States, but I think have been prominent in Europe for much longer. So that's just my thoughts, but I'll pass the mic to someone else who might want to comment.
And by the way, the reason we chose to call this European Perspectives on Learning Experience Design is that Matthew and I, we talked about Bauhaus. And for anyone who doesn't know, Bauhaus was a kind of a, yeah, well, what was it? It was like a piece of art history where it wasn't just about what you saw, but really about architecture, about interior, about a more conceptual approach to how art is the foundation for a lot of different applications. And that's something that I never thought of necessarily as European, but it is quite European. You know, of course, it's German, but that's something that the term Gesamtkunstwerk, like a complete piece of art, is something that's quite common in also in the Netherlands. I have a short story about a project I did when I got my master's degree in interaction design. We did a project on the stock exchange in Amsterdam. This was built by a famous Dutch architect, Berlage. And one of the things he did was for certain spaces, it has a certain function. And instead of saying, I'm going to create a functional room, he said, first, I'm going to ask a poet to write a poem for this space as inspiration, based on what it's going to need to be facilitating. And then once a poem is done, I'm going to give all these different artists and craftsmen the opportunity to design something inspired by that poem. They created like murals and all kinds of wood carvings. And then the whole room came together as a Gesamtkunstwerk, as a complete piece of art that was functional. Now that was, that might sound a bit weird, but that's quite, maybe that's also a bit European, I don't know, but I thought it was really inspiring to see how you could take something as poetry as the foundation for something that might sound rather technical. So maybe by now you're like, what else? What should I talk about? This is all crazy stuff, man.
We do have a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh, there's questions there.
So one is coming from Tammy Huang. You mentioned the importance of emotion. Do you intentionally design for emotion? If so, how to do it, and how does it fit into the 4-quadrant diagram you showed?
All right, so it fits in the diagram in where you talk about the more human-centered or human-focused design disciplines. Those care about how people feel and how their feelings will impact what you create. So I do two things basically. I think about, or I don't just think about, but I analyze and I research the kind of emotions that come into play when people are going to enter the experience that I design. And I think about what kind of emotions an activity or something's going to evoke that's going to be part of this experience. And second, I think about what would I like to see, what kind of experience, what kind of emotions would I like to see in my design. And while that might sound predictable that you want everybody to be happy and joyful, learning is by definition challenging because you're doing something you haven't done before. You're doing something new, so it can be painful. there can also be negative emotions. So I'm not afraid of negative emotions, but I want to treat those respectfully. So let me give you a small example. While me and my team are designing, have been designing quite a few e-learning modules recently, something we traditionally never really did because it's can be a bit limiting for the way that we work. And we are working for this financial institution, and and we learned from our research that the people who work there, they have this, we were designing this mandatory training that people didn't really like. The subject didn't really appeal to them. Having to do this e-learning module based on previous modules, they were like, I'm not looking forward to this. So basically you're already 1-0 behind. But you can say, well, I don't care about how they feel when they see this module. I'm just going to make a nice module. But by thinking about that, they're coming into this with a negative mindset. I don't want to do this. You need to surprise them. You need to show them something that they're like, wait a minute, this isn't standard e-learning. This isn't what I was expecting. And that's the first step. So they're like, okay, this is different. And then as they proceed, they discover that they are going to have a very different experience from what they were expecting. And then that kind of that hesitation or that negativity kind of changes into curiosity, where they're like, wait a minute, I want to know more about this. And part of that is because we find ways to make even the most boring subject exciting. That's one of the things that I love to do. And it's also, when we look at the feedback, when the whole thing was done and people were taking this course, many people refer to it that they were surprised and, in a good way, and that this was much better than they had expected. So that's how you can kind of deal with those emotions. And I see that Samit has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Niels, for the presentation also. So from your explanation, upon Tammy's question, can we say, other than the learning objective for the design, you somehow, either you write it down or not, but you still have some emotional objective in your brain that you want them to feel either during the training or at the end of the training. You may desire to see they should feel confident, or let's say more curious, as you mentioned. Can we say that?
Yeah, so the way I formulate a learning outcome always includes emotional words as well. So I don't just say I am able to, I have learned that, those are learning objectives. And the outcome is really about how someone has changed, how it's made them feel differently, how they see things differently. So yeah, that is part of it. But it's always, interacting with each other, because you can't just say, well, these are, let's say, the learning objectives, and these are the emotional objectives, and they're separate layers. They're always, they're part of the same experience. So it's like a bit of a puzzle to kind of put all the pieces in the right place there. But that's a great remark. Thank you. Let's see. Yeah. And then Sandra says, plus many instructional designers, some from disciplines outside of education, clothing, textile, and design has informed my work in conjunction. That's great. I know it's there are so many places to find inspiration, and I look at other designers, I look at artists, I look at scientists, I look at musicians, there's this British fashion designer, Paul Smith, and I saw a documentary on his work, and he is a bit rebellious in a way, but still, it's quite pricey fashion, but he walks around with his camera all the time and his notebook, and he sees inspiration everywhere. You can hear it in conversations. You can see it in signing, signs or posters. You can see it in people's clothing, and that's where that's what he uses and as kind of a feeding ground for his new collection he's designing. So did you raise your hand again, Samit, or is it still raised? No. Oh, follow-up question. Do you have suggestions on how to collect data and analyze learners' emotions? I actually did a project once where we designed, it was a project for a Dutch university where they wanted to study emotions during an event. So how people in different, so there was a festival, and does the place where you are at a certain point of time influence how you feel? How can you kind of read these emotions? How maybe you can prevent riots or anything? So that was what it's about. And we designed an actual app where people could register their emotions. So yes, you can collect data on that. But if you want to do it really well, then you really need to use like specialized apps. And I honestly haven't used that anymore. I get most of my input from either interviews with learners or from contextual observation. So going to the place where people are, seeing what they do and seeing how things make them feel, what frustrates them, what gives them joy, and stuff like that. Oh, Matthew also has some nice comments on that. So we got 4 minutes left. What can I do for you?
Sorry, Niels, I just posted another question.
You're posting another question. Okay. When you do design and collect feedback from learners, how do you separate their personal preferences and improvement needs? Yeah. So that's part of the aligning perspectives, because a learner might say, well, I want this, or I need this, or I enjoy this. And maybe like an expert or a teacher might say, well, you need this, and you need this, and you need this. And that's where I try to find a balance between what really works for the learner, what needs to be in there. But sometimes I have discussions with like subject matter experts, and I say, well, I know this is important for you, but this really doesn't mean anything to the learner. Does it need to be in there? And they're like, well, maybe not. Maybe it's a bit too specialist. Or so that's something that's a discussion between me, the experts, learner, a client, all stakeholders to see, okay, so what can we agree upon? And as I said, making boring stuff exciting is a fun challenge. So if the learner says, I'm not interested in that topic, and after 30 minutes they're like, this is such a cool topic, then you can use that to your advantage. So thanks for that question. Yeah, 2 thumbs up.
That's 2 thumbs.
And another one.
Awesome. Good.
Well, you just made my evening.
It is evening for Niels. And on that note, Niels, I'm sure it's getting a little bit late for you. I want to thank you so much for taking some time to talk to the AECT constituency. And I'd like to pitch something that that Niels kind of leads, which is the Lxd Conference. It's called Lxd Con. It just finished up this year. I think it's in the 7th year running now. Here's the link to it if you guys are interested. It's annual. I presume it's happening next year. Is that correct, Niels?
Yeah, we're trying to decide if it's going to be a physical conference or a virtual conference. Really would like to have a physical conference once more, and possibly we are going to do it not in the Netherlands, but in the United States of America.
Oh, that'd be lovely. Well,
yeah.
You all have the link now, and that's something that I'll definitely be following up on and watching closely. Again, it's been going on for 7 years. Traditionally it's been face to face, or I'm sorry, it's been online, and it's very affordable as well. I want to say it was like 50 euros to register.
Well, we've done 4 physical conferences and 3 virtual. The virtual are 95 euros, which is $100 for 4 days of LXD fun. That's really cheap, but because we also have people from Africa, from Asia, from South America, you know, we want to make sure they're able to join. So that's why we keep it cheap, and it's a not-for-profit event.
Lovely, that's fantastic.
And I just added my email address in the chat, so if you have any questions, send me an email. I'd be happy to talk.
Good. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.